Yo, what is up, guys? Will here from Fantasy Basketball Flock with Canyon. And we've got some waiver wire ads for week 16 heading up. But before we get into that, if you could drop a like on the video, subscribe if you're not already, if you're interested in fantasy basketball content. We're getting to the final leg of the season, heading into the All-Star break, trying to win you some fantasy championships. And also, before we get into the waiver wire ads, we're about to. If you guys aren't on Underdog Fantasy, great site if you're not familiar. For player props, we do a lot of best ball drafts heading into the seasons. Got a lot of NFL playoff stuff as well as NBA and other sports as well. If you want to check that out, code CANYON. The sign up links in the description as well. 100% deposit match up to $100. But with all that aside, let's get right into the waiver wire ads. First up here, it's a pair of Clippers guys. I do want to call out Norman Powell. He is probably more likely rostered. I think probably roughly like the 60-70%, but he's playing high 20 minutes, even with Kawhi and Paul George healthy. And obviously those guys, when they do miss a games, we see huge upside in usage bump. But high points, he can give you threes and good defensive stats as well. And another guy I want to call out is Terrence Mann, who we saw get the start over Reggie Jackson, and even with the return, he's been starting as well. I know he's had some disappointing games after that monster Rockets game, but honestly, there's a chance he's sitting on waiver wires right now. I think he's going to play solid minutes. I know he's played some similar minutes to Reggie, but he's continuing to get the starts. He's going to have pretty consistent floor value just with the minutes he's going to play. And obviously similar to Powell, if Kawhi or Paul George misses games, and they've been known to do so, especially leading into the All-Star break as well for these guys, man should have some solid performances.
Yeah, definitely. Next up here, we've got Brandon Clark and Xavier Tillman, another pair here. Steven Adams expected to miss 3 to 4 weeks with a PCL sprain in his right knee. And so we're left with Clark and Tillman to kind of assume that usage in that starting role. We saw Tillman with a start more recently against the Kings with that matchup against Sabonis. But I think Brandon Clark, whether he starts or not in some of these games, depending on the matchup, he should probably see more minutes eventually and more usage in fantasy production off the bench. We saw a little bit last year when Steven Adams was out towards the end of the season, and even when he was back in the playoffs and they decided not to play him, Brandon Clark got the nod over Tillman more often than not and was very productive for them, especially in the playoffs. So, I like Brandon Clark a lot more. I think he can end up playing a lot more minutes and be a lot more productive as far as fantasy, obviously giving you points and rebounds and some solid defensive stats, even though Xavier Tillman might see those starter minutes or just start most games depending on that matchup. I don't see him as a big fantasy impact guy because even though if he has those minutes, he's not a very big offensive usage kind of guy for this team, whereas Brandon Clark fits that rim running athletic power forward that is very productive for them and has been in the past. So I prefer Brandon Clark over Tillman, but both these guys could be available in your leagues.
For sure. And real quick, next up here, really quick, Jalen Williams for OKC. Man, we really shouldn't even have to mention his name. He's been a waiver wire guy, one we've talked about weeks before. But as I was checking roster percentages, he's only like 50% rostered on some sites, and he should be rostered pretty much everywhere. I really have no fear. I know OKC is, potentially getting some, they're getting a little bit healthier. Some guys are going to start coming back. But really, I have no concerns about his minutes and his usage and the role he's in right now. I mean, he's arguably, this might be a hot take, arguably the third best player right now. And I think as a rookie, continuing to grow, he's going to have some inconsistent games. So I get that, you see his roster percentage, go up and down a little bit. He has a solid game, and then he gives you, an inconsistent game, and maybe he gets dropped because he was a waiver wire pickup and people thought was their worst player on the roster. But honestly, those inconsistent games just come with rookies, right? And he's played well enough, and honestly, I feel so safe about his upside. Just had a monster game, and I don't think you can count on the game he just gave you. Obviously, crazy defensive stats and scoring, but we've seen him come close, and I think he just has too much upside to be sitting on waivers in leagues.
Yeah, and we've seen the success of a lot of these rookies too in the second half of seasons, right? So we're coming up to that point after All-Star break where a lot of rookies start to come into their own, and so Jalen Williams could definitely be one of those guys. Next up here, we've got Seth Curry for the Nets. Might be rostered in some of your leagues, but surprisingly, he's not in a lot of leagues. So even with Kyrie and Ben healthy, dominating that kind of guard spot for the Nets. Seth is still playing well, finding high minutes and shot volume. He obviously offers above average upside in points and threes, and on the waiver wire, that's not always easy to come by. I mean, he's going to get you, again, a lot of usage, a lot of minutes. Should be able to stumble into a few assists and steals as well, and so even with KD back, it shouldn't impact him too much. This is a pretty key part of this Nets team, or any team that he's on, just as a pure shooter that he is. He has a super good upside to pop off for like 30 on any given night, and there's not a lot of guys on their waiver wire that you can say that about, right? So this is a guy that can easily give you double-digit points and a few threes every night consistently when he's healthy, no matter who's, else is healthy on this team, whether it be Kyrie, Ben, or KD. I like Seth Curry a lot to be kind of one of those waiver wire guys that can give you some pretty high upside versus the rest of the field.
For sure. Next up here, it's a pair of guys. It's Avdia and Gafford for Washington here. Obviously, Porzingis ankle sprain. It's going to keep him out for at least the next week. I mean, wouldn't surprise me with a guy like KP if that's a little bit longer than the initial reports we're seeing. But honestly, the biggest reason that we like these guys as waiver wire pickups, we talked about it a little bit with the Rui move to the Lakers. I mean, I know no KP in this most recent game, but both these guys played 30 plus minutes. I know, maybe the fantasy production from a guy like Gafford wasn't something that you maybe wanted in that kind of big minute game, but man, a guy like that who has the defensive stat block upside, both these guys should give you rebounding and some decent scoring floors as well. I think these guys who are probably on a decent amount of waiver wires just with what their production up until this point in the season has been, but I think they're really, really strong pickups and just have a higher floor than they did previously with Rui out. We saw some solid games earlier in the season when Rui wasn't there. And obviously with some of the injuries the Wizards have had, and KP specifically, man, if KP's going to be missing time, these guys should both give you really, really solid production.
Yeah, definitely. That team is all of a sudden, getting a little bit depleted with the injuries of KP and Beal, so I like those two a lot. Next up here, we've got a couple of traps that I want to mention, some guys that have been publicly trending as popular waiver wire ads in different sites that I just don't think you should really jump on or bite the public bug with. Isaac Okoro is one of those for the Cavaliers. I know that there's trade rumors around Karis LeVert, but, obviously Donovan Mitchell's still there. He's going to be back from the injury very soon. And Darius Garland, they still have their core guys that assume a lot of usage there. So he's been a very popular ad, but I don't think he'll offer very much upside moving forward. He could do a lot of the little things right. I think even in like an NBA perspective, right, as a coach, you might like him a lot, but as a fantasy player, I don't think he's that great. He might get you a couple, defensive stats, but as far as points, rebounds, and assists, he's not going to excel in one category enough to really help you out. I think he's got like a pretty high floor in a couple of those categories, but just the ceiling is just not there to bring him off the waivers and gamble for him to give you a good couple games on any given week. I don't think Okoro is one of those guys. Next up here, another guy that I think is a little bit of a trap is Dario Saric for the Phoenix Suns. He's another guy that's been trending as a popular ad, and he's had a couple good games with some decent minutes for the Suns here, but DeAndre Ayton is back at the time of this recording for the Suns. Cam Johnson's back, CP3's now back, Devin Booker will be back soon, so all those starters that assume so much usage for this team as well are all going to come back, and Saric is going to see a lot less minutes and come off the bench in a much more limited role, and I don't see him being as efficient and productive as a fantasy player off the waivers for you. I mean, he's a good offensive player. He is a good fantasy player, but I think he does need those minutes. And with this Phoenix team really needing to kind of turn it around here halfway through the season, I don't think Sarge is going to be a guy that's going to seed 20 plus minutes very consistently.
For sure. And then last note here, I wanted to have a whole separate column for this guy. And it's Mark Williams, and I'm going to call him kind of a luxury stash. So I know we've talked about Mark Williams previously, and we've talked about the upside if he were, heading down the stretch later in the season with where the Charlotte team's at. If we do see him start to get more, consistently getting pushed up into the 25, 26, 28 minute range, I think his per minute stats would translate well to really, really solid, potentially like top 60, top 70 fantasy production, seemingly out of nowhere off the waiver wire. But, I can't sit here and tell you that that's going to happen. I know we've seen a stretch of games where it seems like he's playing, 15, 17. Oh, he's up to 19 minutes over the past couple. And then he just plays 5 minutes out of nowhere. And honestly, I don't want to sit here and pretend like I know what the Charlotte coaching staff is going to do. And I know there's a lot of trade rumors, whatever, especially with a team like Charlotte with where they're at and a guy like Plumlee with an expiring contract. But I think the important note I want to make with a guy like Mark Williams is he is a luxury stash. So in fantasy basketball specifically, we love talking about upside, but what's so important is being able to play the waiver wire. So when you pick up a guy like Mark Williams, just know he probably will give you very disappointing games. You might get some goose eggs. He'll give you some decent games. Obviously, he has just random wild defensive stat upside we've seen over this past couple stretch of games. And he can give you just, random decent scoring games and good rebounding games. But more likely than not, you are going to get some duds. The luxury stash, in my opinion, in that kind of phrase, is more of a, if you can afford to do that, if you're able to hold him for the next week or two to kind of just see what happens and see if you can, out of nowhere, have this really strong fantasy producer for your team. But I don't think he's necessarily worth hurting your team to stash and hope for that, because obviously we've talked about it before. If you're holding on to players and you're not playing the waiver wires, you're not only missing out on what another player could give you off the waiver wires, you're missing out on the additional games you'd get from picking up, dropping, and playing players who have additional games that week, maxing the games that you can play to win your weeks. So luxury stash, want to call him out for that. But that's going to do it for the waiver wire ads for this week. Let us know in the comments if we forgot anybody, if you think there's somebody who should be a strong waiver wire pickup we didn't mention. As always, any questions you guys have, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear. Appreciate you guys. See you in the next one.